Okay, so we're talking about the judicial branch today, and quite honestly, there's really not that much to remember for the judicial branch. So let's just kind of hit the highlights. The highlights for the judicial branch is they check everybody with judicial review. Judicial review, of course, was established by Marbury versus Madison. And judicial review is an important check because it allows the Supreme Court to review the constitutionality of laws and executive orders and executive actions, things like that. And it's, you know, the ultimate check. Now, one of the things we remember about the Supreme Court is that, and, you know, Article 3 about the judicial branch is the shortest of all the articles. And one of the things about Article 3 is there wasn't a whole lot put in there. And so afterwards, Congress passed the Judiciary Act, I forget the year, maybe 1789, that basically set up the lower courts. And so all of those kind of feed in. Now we have state laws and then we have federal laws. And so unless you're challenging the constitutionality of something, they either go to a federal court or state court. And our focus is, of course, on federal law. Now, you can be breaking a state law and a federal law. It is possible to be charged in both. For example, we recently were discussing the Oklahoma City bombing, and Timothy McVeigh was charged with both state laws and federal laws that he had broken and the horrible act that he committed. So it is possible that you could have both. So, but ultimately, anything dealing with the Constitution can be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. So it is important to note that most cases don't get appealed and don't make it all the way there, and that the majority of cases that the Supreme Court does hear, actually, they uphold the lower decision. For example, they just made a decision, I forget the name of the case, and it was kind of surprising, it had to do with guns, but they upheld the lower court decision. And that's what happens most of the time. Remember that literally, you know, 10,000 cases are appealed every year to the Supreme Court, and they, you know, it's thousands of them, and they usually only hear, you know, 100. And so it's not a very large number that they actually hear. A case like, let's take, for example, somebody maybe in Virginia who felt like their rights had been violated. That could be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, but it may not actually make it there. But it would go to like Virginia State Supreme Court and then so on. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and they serve for life. And that's a very important concept, the fact that they serve for life. And this is the kind of question that might come up. Like, you might have to do an argumentative essay that says, why is it important for justices to serve for life? So does anybody have a thought on why justices serve for life? Like, what was the thought behind that? Like, it talks about it in Federalist 78 about this. Like, why do we need to have them serve for life and have them appointed, not elected?
Doesn't that have to do with like protecting their I guess like integrity as a judge?
Yes.
Like if they had to repeatedly run for their position, you know, they might not be able to make decisions completely unbiased.
Yeah, so basically what we want to do is we want to keep them politically isolated. If they have to run for election, then they're thinking about re-election and appeasing the public. Remember that most Supreme Court cases actually are not like politically hot topics. They're kind of like happening a little bit later. And they don't think about public opinion when they're making their decision. They're looking at the Constitution and making those decisions. And so the idea that they serve for life, they don't ever have to worry about re-election or anything like that, and it keeps them politically isolated so that they're not unduly influenced by kind of the situations going on. Like, once the president appoints them, they're not ever meeting with the president again to talk about like what the president's views are on whatever case is in front of them, okay? And their atmosphere, they themselves, you know, when we look at the court, like the court right now is very conservative. We've seen more liberal courts, like for example, during the time period of say like Brown versus Board of Education, like the Burger Court, and then up through like Roe v. Wade, that was a more liberal court. Right now we have 5 conservative justices. So the 4 more liberal justices would be Stephen Breyer, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and I can't think of Justice Kagan's first name. And so those are the more liberal justices, and the others are more conservative. There are some swing votes, but there's some that we can count on that are always going to be fairly conservative. People have been very interested to see Gorsuch, who is the one of our most recent appointments, how that he hasn't always been as conservative as they thought he might be. Kavanaugh, the most recent appointment, has definitely lived up to being as conservative as we thought he would be. Clarence Thomas also is very conservative. So when a decision is handed down, there is always the Chief Justice assigns who's going to write the majority opinion. And then if it's not unanimous, then there's also a dissenting opinion. And then the most senior judge of the dissenters is who assigns those. So for example, if the liberals dissented, then Ruth Bader Ginsburg is actually the one, because she's the most senior liberal justice. She's the one who assigns the dissenting opinion. And she doesn't always take them for herself. So, she passes them, they divvy them out. And you can concur with the majority opinion, but for a different reason. And you can have a separate dissenting opinion if you don't agree. The idea is that we really just kind of want one majority opinion and one dissenting opinion. We don't necessarily want all of those different ones. Okay. I'm going to check. Let me flip back over to the questions, guys, because I thought there was a couple of good ones in there to make sure that I cover all of those. So the ideology of the court can change over time with people on the court. Justices also can become, for example, Sandra Day O'Connor, when she was appointed, she was the first woman on the court, and she was appointed by Reagan, and so therefore she was a conservative justice. However, the longer she served on the court, she was not as conservative as when she started. And so a person's ideology can shift over time. Furthermore, when we see with justices too, they very much have rationale behind them. It's very interesting to read like Clarence Thomas's decisions, because he has a very interesting, the way he takes the Constitution very seriously, and everybody does, of course. But there is kind of the two sides of the Constitution, how you interpret it, and it's whether or not it's exactly what it was meant when it was written, or we kind of got to understand that we're going to loosely interpret this because maybe time has changed. So there are those who always go back to, what did the founders have to say? What was their rationale? What did the Federalist Papers say? What did the Brutus Papers say? Versus, okay, gender was never mentioned in the Constitution. However, the 14th Amendment really does need to apply to gender as well. Now, when we think about that, when you're making a decision like that, that's two important terms called judicial activism and judicial restraint. So Brown versus the Board of Education would be a case that was judicially active, because the precedent had been segregation was okay, that separate but equal was okay, which we know had been established under Plessy versus Ferguson. And then with a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court says, by definition, if it is separate, it is not equal. And this is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. That was what we call judicial activism. A lot of people have accused Sonia Sotomayor of being judicially active. Like, there were people who didn't want her on the court because they felt like she was too judicially active and she wasn't as restrained. Judicial restraint is more, let's keep kind of the status quo, we'll keep with what precedent is. But remember, the majority of the decisions that the Supreme Court made, stare decisis, that's that fancy Latin word that basically means let the decision stand. And it keeps with what the previous decision of the lower court was. And that's usually like 90% of the time. Okay, let's see what other questions we had on there. So what can Congress do if they don't like, we talked about this the other day with the powers, what can Congress do if they don't like the ruling that the Supreme Court says?
Oh, they can impeach them.
They could, but you're being impeached for like a misdemeanor. Like if we feel like maybe they read the Constitution wrong, like what were you guys thinking? Like you think it's okay that you said it's constitutional, every single person in the world has to shave their head and get a swastika tattoo. Yeah, somebody's been drinking some funny Kool-Aid. So we're gonna have to get rid of those. Okay, possibly. We haven't had any Supreme Court justices impeached, but of course we have had judges impeached. I think the number's in the 80s. What's like an actual action that Congress can take?
They could make a law or amend the Constitution to get around that
Yes.
decision.
They could make a new law that maybe they feel like is constitutional and wait for that to go through. The best way would be, of course, to make an amendment. So let's say, for example, Roe v. Wade. Currently, Supreme Court says that abortion is protected, right? If we change the Constitution to say that abortion is not protected under the right to privacy and that abortion is illegal after, say, third trimester or whatever we want to say, that would change Roe v. Wade, wouldn't it? Okay, and all the cases that came after it, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, et cetera. And so they can always make an amendment, which of course would require approval of the states, but that's a great way to do it. We also talked about the president, that the president could simply choose what? To not enforce it, right? And we saw that it took a while. They finally had to enforce Brown versus Board of Education because states weren't complying. And so they gave them time to comply. And then when some of the southern states weren't complying, they forced them to comply by sending in the National Guard. And so that is definitely something that the president, you know, that kind of his role. The bureaucratic agencies are part of that enforcing because the bureaucratic agencies are making sure that these things are going through. Like you guys remember Citizens United versus FEC, which said basically that super PACs are okay, right? That unlimited donations to super PACs. But if you're a PAC, you can't give, like a super PAC, you can't give directly to the candidate, right? You have to do issue advocacy. You have to say like, let's say Zane's running for senator. I'm gonna run a campaign against Zane. Instead of giving money to his candidate, I'm just gonna run ads that show how bad Zane is or whatever, okay? Or if I like Zane, I'm still gonna run ads maybe against the guy running against him. So one of those bureaucratic agencies is the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. I've been running into this. You guys know that I'm the president of my local union, but I'm also the treasurer for our SinvaServe, which is our regional office. So we have a PAC, and I've mentioned to you before that I donate to the VEA NEA PAC, which is Kids First. So one of the things that I just realized as treasurer that I found out I have to do, I have to actually do a reporting every quarter to the Virginia Department of Elections. And I have to say, Crystal DeLong gave $20 to this. Like we have to literally report. And so the FEC, that's their job. They're a bureaucratic agency. If they stopped enforcing that, if they stopped doing their job and like, oh, people don't have to report, how would we know how much money people have given? And so that's an example how a bureaucratic agency has to do their job. And so they had to change rules once Citizens United was decided. Okay. All right. Remember that the court's jurisdiction is determined by Congress. Congress could also, when you think about checks that Congress has over the courts, Congress not only could they change jurisdiction, Congress could also expand the court. Remember that FDR, he really tried to appeal to Congress and ask them to pack the court. Like he wanted to pack the court because he didn't have enough liberals on the court, and so he wanted more liberals on the court. There has been discussion I have heard about talking about increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. So that is something that would have to come through Congress, not something that the president does. Now, for me, the most important part about the judicial branch is actually the court cases. And that's really Unit 3, which is why when I taught this, I taught judicial branch with Unit 3 because to me, they are married together, okay? So that's kind of my summary on the judicial branch. We're gonna do some little practice questions here, but do you have any questions so far on the judicial branch? So the things I think they could ask about it, if they're not asking about specific cases, could be those terms, judicial activism, judicial restraint, or something about the power of the court. And a very important distinction about the court should not make policy, okay? I actually did a paper on this and I've read some books about this, about is the court of the modern time period making policy? The court is not intended to make policy. The court is intended to check policy, to see if laws and policy are constitutional. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna flip over to, we're actually gonna start with a judicial court question, and then we'll move over to a presidential question. All right, so this is the question that I was writing with some of my friends. Nobody has added on to it. So I just made up a couple of questions. So let's see if we can come up with some claims that are theses that are related to these. Okay, number one says, develop an argument that explains whether the Supreme Court justices should be appointed or elected by the people. Okay, somebody added in, or develop an argument on the legitimacy of an unelected judiciary in a republic. Okay, so somebody tell me why it's important that the justices should be not elected, that they should be appointed.
I think, like we said earlier, that if they get elected, then they're gonna be, you know, they're gonna have to pick a side, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and I think that that would show like what they're gonna, what's the word I'm looking for? Like what they're gonna decide on a court case.
Yes. Okay, sorry. I just realized that I just sent out that NHS letter and my stuff's getting blown up right now. So let me reply to everyone real quickly since I forgot them all. Okay, let's try this. Forward to. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Yes, so what you just said, Sydney, is exactly right. So we want to make sure that they're isolated, politically isolated. And so if I was writing this, I would say that the Supreme Court justices should be appointed in order to ensure that they are politically isolated and not influenced by elections. So that's my claim, right? And then I need to back that up. Federalist 78 is going to be your obvious support for that, because Federalist 78 basically says exactly that. Okay. All right. So that's kind of what the same thing says there. Who can make an argument for why the judicial branch is actually the most powerful of the three? So you could argue against it. We'll argue against it in a minute, but who can say that finish this statement, that a judicial branch is the most important of the three, powerful of the three branches because I would argue because, go ahead, Sydney.
I was just gonna say that they, with really big cases that could like be the starting point of, you know, something new, maybe like Roe v. Wade about the whole abortion topic, they can decide on what it's gonna be, and from there on out, that's how it's gonna be.
Okay, so that is a perfect example. So what I would say then in my thesis is I would say, because with judicial review, they are the ultimate check on any decision Congress or the president makes. And then give an example of, for example, in Roe v. Wade, they changed the way the country, blah, 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 and it has never been, and even though there have been challenges since then, it hasn't been overturned, and that was in 1973. So it stood for almost 50 years, okay? You could talk about how Brown versus Board of Education and then Heart of Atlanta. So you could pick some court cases. You also could use Federalist 78 and talk about judicial review. You could use Marbury versus Madison, anything like that. But the thing that makes the Supreme Court so powerful is that they have that ultimate check with judicial review. Now, What if I was to argue and say that the judicial branch is not the most powerful branch, it's actually Congress, because Congress what?
Because they actually make the laws.
Yes, because they actually make the laws, right? So they make the laws. They also, if they're also in charge of the budget, so that they control any of that. They can control the size of the court. They can control the court's jurisdiction. So basically, you would just need to talk about the checks they have. I would use the Constitution as my document to start with and talk about the powers that they have. And then for my second piece of evidence, I might actually talk about like a law or something that made like a huge difference. Like, for example, the Civil Rights Act. So like Brown versus Board of Education was passed, Heart of Atlanta was passed. But when did things really start to change? Once the Civil Rights Act was passed, that ensured that voting and all those things happened. So while all those court cases were lovely, we didn't see actual impact until the Civil Rights Act was passed. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Does anybody want to argue why the president is most powerful? Could you argue his singular influence as a one person versus like all the members of Congress? And then I might talk about the use of the bully pulpit, executive orders, and executive agreements, and how the president, while he doesn't have the power to declare war, he does have the power to move troops. And so you could talk about all the power that's in the presence of one person. And you could use Federalist 70. You could use the Constitution to support you for those. Okay. Now, that actually is very similar. Can you guys see this, my Word document, or do I need to change my sharing settings? You can see the Word document, develop an argument that's, no, you can't. Okay. I thought I had to switch back and forth. Okay. So this is one that another teacher wrote. It says, develop, which goes with our unit 2, develop an argument that supports, modifies, or refutes high school, refutes historian, author Schlesinger Jr.'s claim in the imperial presidency, which doesn't matter if you've read that or anything. Here's the claim. He says that the U.S. presidency has exceeded its constitutional limits. Okay? Agree or disagree? So let's do agree first. The president has exceeded his constitutional limits because, what's my thesis here?
I would probably try to say something about his, like, I guess like today, I think probably the best example would be using his influence, like through social media to persuade or something.
Okay, so the bully pulpit. So the president uses his position through the media to exceed his constitutional power through persuasion. And then you could talk about agenda setting, how the president sets the agenda, how the president uses the bully pulpit, okay? And how that none of these are in the Constitution. What about his use of executive orders? Can they be abused? Yeah, the only check on executive order is if the judicial branch, and it has to be challenged to get there, right? Remember, the Supreme Court does not review every single law that Congress passes. They only review the laws that come to them in a challenging case. The only thing they're going to review with the executive orders is when somebody challenges it. Do you remember, the Muslim ban? The executive order that President Trump did pretty early into his presidency, banning Muslims from certain countries, entering certain countries. That was challenged in the Supreme Court. It was found to be constitutional. Just like, for example, my favorite executive order, and I'm being greatly sarcastic here, that would be FDR's executive order for the internment of Japanese Americans. You know what, guys? I think that's one of the reasons I don't like FDR. I think that is a big reason, actually. I don't like FDR. That was challenged in the Supreme Court, and it was found to be constitutional. Good job, guys. So later on, of course, we apologized and like, oh yeah, that was a total violation of your civil liberties. It only took us 40 years to realize that, but hey. Okay, so we can argue those. Now, how could I say, no, the president actually hasn't exceeded his limits? Here's what I would do. I would say the president has not actually exceeded his limits. Did anybody have a thought before I finish?
I was just gonna say you could probably argue that the president of the United States is still an individual, and that, like, say, the bully pulpit is just an extension of his First Amendment right to free speech or whatever.
Okay, so I would say that no matter what the president has done, there are still checks on his power that are still used today by Congress and the judicial branch, such as impeachment and judicial review. And then I would give the specific examples, even of like President Trump being impeached, having judicial review, and how that no matter what this person does, there's still checks on their power. The War Powers Resolution Act, like for example, the Constitution says the president does not have the right to declare war. That's Congress. There are limits on that. War Powers Resolution Act, those kind of things. So you would just have to show that while people may argue that the president has expanded power beyond its constitutional limits, that the Supreme Court and the Congress still keep the president in check, okay? Now, do you have to agree with whatever thesis you decide to write? No.
Not at all.
You need to pick the one that is easiest for you to argue. Do not sit there and say, well, I don't know. No, pick a side and then argue it, okay? You do not have to agree. If you have not just noticed, I have argued both sides of every question I've asked you, and I have yet to give my opinion on any of it, okay? So you can completely do that. All right. Now, so the concept question we have, which can use anything that we've been talking about, and most of us think that it's going to relate somehow to like federalism. They could bring in a court case. I'm going to show you on Sunday or sometime next week an example of how they brought in a court case on the concept, okay? And actually, when we were practicing the answer, I brought in the same case, so it's easy to do. Remember, you got that example, right? What makes your answer better? When you give a what? An example. Like when Sydney was just talking about, what Zane was just talking about, like those examples you guys are providing, that's what gives you that stronger answer, okay? So that's what you want to focus on. And it's the same thing in the argumentative essay. How you prove your point. You give your thesis. You give that, you got to have that backup document, right? One has to come from the list. The other one says, it usually says something like this, any other thing you learned in class. And that's where your landmark cases can come from. It could be one of the other documents. It could be something like that, okay? Now remember in Google Classroom, what I have done, so let's come back over here to Google Classroom. All right, so in Google Classroom, in classwork, so in classwork, we've got stuff that can help you during the AP exam. We've got the foundational documents. We've got that powers and limitations chart. So what I would like you to work on, I would like to have this done by Monday. I have placed in there landmark required SCOTUS cases. So I've given each of you one. If you want to take it upon yourself to do more than one, feel free. I have done 2 so far to give you an example. So Marbury versus Madison, judicial review, Article 3 in the Constitution. Marbury was a, so what I want you to, so tell me the constitutional like issue or whatever it is. And then give me the brief summary, like what do we need to know? So Marbury was a last-minute judge appointed by John Adams. President Jefferson refused to deliver his appointment. Chief Justice Marshall established judicial review and examining the act. Marbury did not get his appointment. Basically, Madison was very, Chief Justice Marshall was very smart here. He was like, I can't make Jefferson mad, but I still got to uphold what Madison did. So he basically said, okay, the law that was passed is actually not constitutional, but if it was, Marbury should have gotten his appointment. So he kind of basically made both people, nobody super mad, nobody super happy. So it was a good decision in that sense. Thank you, Nathan. So then basically all you got to remember is judicial review, right? So then I did Gideon versus Wayne Wright, since this one is a little different. So Gideon versus Wayne Wright was a Sixth Amendment, specifically right to a lawyer. So Gideon was not provided a lawyer under Florida law. So under Florida law, if what you did was not a felony, you did not have to have a lawyer. He asked for one because he couldn't afford one, and they were told him under Florida law, you don't have to be appointed one. So it was challenged to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court answered and said, yeah, actually, you should be able to. So remember that selective incorporation, which, if I'm talking about important vocabulary words, that is the most important vocabulary word in that Civil Rights and Civil Liberties unit, which we'll be talking about next week. Remember, selective incorporation is the application of the Bill of Rights to the states over time. So not all of the Bill of Rights have been selectively incorporated. Like, for example, the quartering of troops, the Third Amendment has not been. And up until recently, excessive bail was not. It was just recently in the past year has been selectively incorporated. So it started with the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and it has since been expanded. And the biggest part of selective incorporation has happened around rights to the accused, such as search and seizure with Mapp v. Ohio, which is not a required case. Or Miranda versus Arizona, which the rights to the accused, you have the right to remain silent, like your Fifth and Sixth Amendment. And so that's also not one of your required cases. So Nathan, I gave you McCulloch versus Maryland. Katie's not on here. Sydney, U.S. versus Lopez. Maria's not on here. Caleb's not on here. Will. Shaylee, Shank versus U.S. And then Zane, Citizens United versus FEC. So again, if you're feeling helpful and you'd like to do another one that doesn't have a name under it, that's fine. I will fill in all the ones that nobody gets to. So you don't have to take two if you don't want to. And I tried to take the super obvious, easy ones and tried to give you guys maybe some of the others. And I kept Shaw and Reno and Baker v. Carr for myself, since they're the gerrymandering cases that nobody ever really remembers. All right. So that's what I would like you to do for me for Monday when we meet, okay? We are going to meet Sunday afternoon to talk about the actual facts of logging in and all that stuff, which I know some of your other teachers have talked to you about. I will put links for any of these that are weird or whatever. I'll make sure all the links are on here so you can always refer back to this, and I'll make sure that this stays as the top post in classroom, okay? And remember, if you scroll down and you need a little extra review, all this stuff is on here for you, okay? This other guy, if you want somebody different, he reviews all the branches. It might be nice to go back now that we've done Unit 1 and Unit 2. Watch his little videos. See how you're feeling about it. If you want to go back and watch the ones that we did in class, Unit 1, Unit 4, and Unit 5 are the other Unit 2 and Unit 3. That's Unit 4 that's my Unit 4, but it's really Unit 2, and Unit 5 is really Unit 3. I know that's confusing. Okay? All right. Yeah, any questions?
I just have a question. So the Monday we take our test, obviously it's a week later we take our comparative.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. Are we gonna start reviewing the day after? Okay.
Yes. Monday, I actually started putting that on there, I think. Shoot, where's my stupid share screen? Helps if I hit the right button here. I actually wrote that on there. I said, test May 11th, Tuesday, May 12th, start comparative review. So hopefully that's fresher in our minds. I can give you some comparative stuff right now, but I feel like you're focusing on US right now, right? You don't want any comparative right now, do you? Okay, all right. Yeah, let's just focus on US and then we'll get that out of the way and then we'll be hardcore comparative. And I'll do whatever I need to do. If you want me to meet with you every single day between now and comparative, you know, whatever. We'll do what we need to do, okay?
I have a question about in general.
Yep.
Dyso was talking about how for stats, you know, we might see a 15-point question. We only have 25 minutes to do it, like to solve it, but like
Yep.
we're expected to complete the entire question. Like we
Mhm.
don't have to complete the entire question to get a 5. Do you know if it's going to be like that for comparative?
Well, comparative and US are the same thing. Like basically,
Not comparative stat, or for government instead of stat. Sorry.
I mean, US and comparative are basically the same. Like you have the two questions, the argumentative and the, in comparative, it's like a comparison thing. But you have, the questions have points. And so, for example, in US, the points are 5 and 7, or
Mhm.
3 and 7, 3 and 7. You don't have to answer all parts of the question. Like you can, like say you get 6 out of the 7 points on the thesis, argumentative, and you only get 2 out of the 3 on the other, like you get partial credit. It's not like if you don't finish answering, they'll grade what you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because like she was saying, like we might see a like say a stats question that is like all like part A through J, but like we don't have to answer the entire thing to get like a 5.
Oh, no, you need to answer every, so if you want a 5 in government, you're going to have to answer it and get all the points to get a 5.
Okay.
Maybe of the 10 points, you might could get 9 out of 10 and still get a 5. Maybe 8 out of 10 points. But anything below that, I'd say you're looking at a 4 or a 3.
I just need a 4 or a 5 on either government or comparative.
Here's the good news. For the first time ever, there is no limit on how many people can get a 5 or 4 or 3. They always curve the exam. And they basically set no more than this people can get a 5. We're only going to give out this many 4s. We're only going to give out this many 3s. That's what they do in the world. This year, they're saying we're not doing that. If everybody who doesn't get a 5, then it's a 100% 5s. So that plays in your favor. So that's the good news. Also, same rules apply. We're not supposed to discuss the answers with you for 48 hours till they're released. So just all that good stuff. I got my reading invite today. So yeah.
At least you won't have to like fly out to Denver or something to read.
Yeah, I go to Salt Lake City. So it's actually kind of nice because I get to be with my friends. Like I got a really good friend from Italy and some friends from different parts of the country that I get together with. So it's really kind of nice, and we don't get to do all that. It's also really good professional development. I'm also really worried about staying focused. Like it's hard enough focused when you're in a room of people just reading, and then what happens when I'm in my house. Although I'm getting really good at this virtual stuff. So maybe it'll be okay.
I hate the whole waiting until like the end of June to get your scores, because at
Yeah.
that point you're just kind of like, oh yeah, I forgot I took AP classes last year.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this time it'll be a quicker turnaround since everything's on the computer.
They said June 20th.
That's better. It's usually July.
Oh yeah, because it was July 7th last year.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's usually July when you find out. So, all right.